Hello and welcome to Indus News live from Islamabad. I'm Jawad Tehami and these are the headlines. In the American state of Wisconsin, 2 Black Lives Matter protesters have been shot dead by a gunman in Kenosha City. Police say another was injured when the assailant opened indiscriminate fire after being confronted by the protesters. Wisconsin has been rattled by unrest for the third straight night after police killing of an African-American man sparked protests. Nato has called for a free and fair elections in Belarus, which has been rocked by weeks of protests against this month's presidential vote. Speaking before a meeting of the European Union defense ministers in Berlin, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg warns Belarusian authorities against using the bloc as a pretext to launch a crackdown on protesters. Belarus President Alexander Lukashenko has accused the alliance of interfering in the country's internal matters. Israel says it has struck multiple observation posts of Hezbollah in Lebanon after shots were fired from across the border. Meanwhile, Israel also bombed the Gaza Strip for the 14th consecutive night, accusing Hamas of launching incendiary balloons. No casualties have been reported from either of the two attacks so far. India has reported the world's highest COVID-19 spike in the past 24 hours, with over 67,000 people testing positive, taking tally to 3.2 million. In Pakistan, 12 people have lost their lives to the virus overnight, taking the death count to 6,267, with over 294,000 infections. Globally, the pandemic has infected over 23.9 million people and taken more than 819,000 lives. At least 70 people have died in floods following torrential rains in Afghanistan's eastern Parwan province. The authorities said 110 others were injured in floods-related incidents, while dozens of houses and vehicles were also destroyed in Jarikar town. Those were the headlines and detailed stories. Right after a short break. Stay tuned. Welcome back, and now for the news in detail. In the American state of Wisconsin, a Black Lives Matter protester has been shot dead by a gunman on the streets of Kenosha City. Police say 2 others were injured in the incident. A video shared on social media showed several protesters chasing away the gunman, who then opened indiscriminate fire on them. Wisconsin has been rattled by unrest for the third straight night after police killing of an African-American man sparked fired by police on Sunday. According to civil rights attorney Ben Crump, 3 of the Jacob Blake's young sons inside the automobile witnessed their father being gunned down. NATO has called for a free and fair elections in Belarus, which has been rocked by weeks of protests against this month's presidential vote. Speaking before a meeting of European Union defense ministers in Berlin, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg warned Belarusian authorities against using the bloc as a pretext to launch a crackdown on protesters. He said that there was no NATO military buildup in the region. Belarus's President Alexander Lukashenko has accused the alliance of interfering in the country's internal matters. NATO chief's remarks come as authorities in Belarus steadily stepped up the pressure on protesters, pushing for Lukashenko's resignation. Several opposition activists have been jailed, while others have been summoned for questioning. Israel says it has struck multiple observation posts of Hezbollah in Lebanon after shots were fired from across the border. The military said the shots were fired during operational activity in northern Israel. It said the troops fired illumination flares, smoke shells, and used live fire. Meanwhile, Hezbollah-run media outlet said Israel fired phosphorus munitions at the Lebanese side of the border. Earlier, Israel also bombed the Gaza Strip for the 14th consecutive night, accusing Hamas of launching incendiary balloons. No casualties have been reported from either of the two attacks so far. Lebanon's Supreme Defense Council has slammed the Israeli aggression in the south of the country along the border. Earlier, Israel said it struck multiple Hezbollah posts after shots were fired from across the border. The council said it has tasked the caretaker foreign minister with the filing of a complaint to the United Nations. Israeli military said the troops fired illumination flares, smoke shells, and used live fire, while the Hezbollah-run media outlet said Israel fired phosphorus munitions. Israel also bombed the Gaza Strip for the 14th consecutive night, accusing Hamas of launching explosive balloons. No casualties have been reported from either of the two attacks so far. Meanwhile, the U.S. has increased its efforts to bring more Middle Eastern countries into the Abraham Accord it brokered between the UAE and Israel. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo arrived in Bahrain. Pompeo held meetings with his Bahraini counterpart Abdul Latif bin Rashid Al Zaini and other senior officials. He also spoke to Abu Dhabi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan over the phone. The UAE's state media said both leaders discussed the prospects for strengthening Abu Dhabi's peace deal with Israel. Pompeo traveled first to Jerusalem and then to Sudan yesterday. However, Sudan's Prime Minister Abdullah Hamdok told the top US diplomat that his government does not have the mandate to decide on normalization of ties with Israel. Yemen's separatists have announced to suspend their participation in consultations on a power-sharing deal for the south. In a statement, the Southern Transition Council said they suspended the talks over the government's irresponsible behavior. The council said the suspension was necessary to push the government for full commitment to the Riyadh agreement. It cited the collapse of the public services in the south and the military escalation by the government forces in Abyan province as the main reasons. The UAE-backed Southern Council said it has been fully complying with the accord. Saudi Arabia has been trying to implement the deal to end the conflict between the separatists and the Yemeni government. The Yemeni allies have been in a standoff since August last year when the STC captured Aden. In Pakistan, 3 days of monsoon rains have killed at least 90 people across the country. National Disaster Management Authority says the torrential downpour has damaged at least 1,000 of homes. The agency said 31 deaths were reported in southern Sindh province, while 23 people died in the province of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. It said 15 deaths were reported in southwestern Balochistan province and 8 in Punjab. 13 more people died elsewhere in northern Pakistan, including 3 in Azad, Jammu and Kashmir. The Disaster Management Authority said Pakistan Army troops evacuated over 1,000 people from inundated areas of Karachi, while 300 people from a rain-hit district of Dadu in Sindh province were rescued using boats. Pakistan says over 100,000 Kashmiris have been murdered by Indian forces in occupied Jammu and Kashmir so far. Pakistan's representative to the UN, Munir Akram, said more than 22,000 women have been widowed and raped by the occupation forces. In a statement on the International Day of Remembrance and Tribute to the Victims of Terrorism, Akram said the world leaders should seek to prosecute the Indian civil and the military personnel involved in state terrorism in IOJK. He said since the 5th of August last year, 8 million Kashmiris have been under siege. Akram pointed out that Kashmiri political leaders have been imprisoned, while 13,000 youths have been abducted and tortured. At least 70 people have died in floods following torrential rains in Afghanistan's eastern Parwan province. The authorities said 110 others have been injured in floods-related incidents. A spokesperson for provincial government says dozens of houses and vehicles were destroyed in Charikar town of the province. According to locals, no rescue teams have yet arrived in the area. The Taliban say they have discussed the latest development in the Afghan peace process with the German Special Envoy for Afghanistan, Marcus Potzer. Spokesperson Sohail Shaheen said Potzer met with the delegation of the group led by the head of the European section, Abdul Haq Wasik, in Doha. He said the two sides also talked about the release of the prisoners and the start of the inter-Afghan talks. Shaheen said the German Special Envoy stressed the need to implement the Doha Agreement to speed up the peace process. India has reported the world's highest COVID-19 spike in the past 24 hours, with over 67,000 people testing positive, making the tally to 3.2 million. Globally, the virus has infected over 23.9 million people and taken more than 819,000 lives. More in this report.
After keeping the Americas in its crosshairs for months, the novel coronavirus has set its sights on India. The Indian Health Ministry says 1,059 more people have died, taking the tally to over 59,000. Pointing out a global surge in cases over the past 6 weeks, the Pan American Health Organization says young people are the biggest carriers of the virus. Meanwhile, Cuba has joined others in clinical trials of its indigenously produced COVID-19 vaccine named Soberana 01.
In spite of the hurricane and the storm, we started the clinical trial of the Soberana 1 vaccine with all the rigorous measures in place that a clinical trial implies. International Center of Toxicology of our country. I believe that Cuba is the only country in Latin America that has been able to start this trial, an achievement for Cuban science.
In Asia, mainland China has reported 15 new imported cases, while there has been no domestically transmitted infections for the third day straight. While South Korea is mulling tightening restrictions again as it records 320 cases overnight. Over in Australia, Victoria State continues to struggle as it reports 24 more deaths.
I'm saddened to have to inform you that there are now 462 Victorians who have lost their life due to this global pandemic. That's an increase of 24 since yesterday's report. Of course, our thoughts and best wishes, our sympathies and deepest condolences are with the families of each of those 24 Victorians.
In Europe, Spain has decided to employ its military to enforce restrictions. The second wave of the virus appears to be slowing in France as its new daily infections drop. Citing a decline in cases, Hungary has decided to reopen schools next week.
Meanwhile, in Pakistan, number of active COVID-19 cases has dropped under the 9,000 mark as the pandemic continues to decline in the country. The Health Ministry said the recovery rate from the disease is 94%. It said 482 new cases were reported across the country overnight, taking the toll to over 294,000. The ministry said 12 more people died in the past 24 hours. The nationwide death toll stands at 6,267. Sindh remains the worst hit province, witnessing nearly 128,000 infections, while Punjab has reported over 96,000 cases so far. More stories to follow, but right after a short break. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Militants have killed 20 people during attacks on 3 villages in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. In a statement, a military spokesman said militants are deliberately attacking civilians. The killings come just 3 days after a similar raid that left 13 people dead. The Allied Democratic Forces, a Ugandan armed group, have killed over 1,000 civilians since the start of 2019. Turkey says it will not compromise its rights in the Mediterranean as well as Aegean and the Black Sea. Speaking in Istanbul, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan said Turkey has no designs on any other country's lands, sovereignty or interests. The Turkey president said they are prepared to confront anyone who wants to pay its price. Erdogan also called on Turkey's counterparts to avoid mistakes that he said would bring their destruction. Turkey and Greece are at odds over claims to hydrocarbon resources in the Mediterranean Sea. Storm Laura has claimed 21 lives after lashing Haiti, leaving 198 families homeless. Haitian Civil Protection Office says 5 people are still missing, while the capital Port-au-Prince's roads have submerged in water. The U.S. National Hurricane Center says Laura has now turned into Category 2 hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico, picking maximum sustained winds of 165 kilometers per hour. NHC says Laura is predicted to become a major hurricane prior to landfall on the upper Texas or Louisiana coasts. It says storm surge could penetrate as much as 30 miles inland and in southwest Louisiana. Isolated tornadoes are also expected from the storm. Australia says it will boost defense spending by nearly $717 million to upgrade military facilities and offer additional employment. Addressing media, Prime Minister Scott Morrison announced these measures in the latest stimulus package against COVID-19. Morrison said the move will grow the country's military and create an additional 4,000 jobs. He said many of the military facilities earmarked for upgrades will be in areas impacted by bushfires earlier this year. The move will also fulfill Australia's commitment to growing defense spending to more than 2% of its GDP. The University of Cambridge says it is aiming to start clinical trials of its possible coronavirus vaccine in September. This comes a day after Oxford and AstraZeneca said their jointly produced vaccine will be registered this year. The university says it has received $2.5 million in funding from the British government. University's head of the Laboratory of Viral Zoonotics said they are looking at all the crucial pieces of the virus that can be used to construct the vaccine. He said the aim is to make a vaccine that provides immunity against all forms of the coronavirus, not just COVID-19. The scientists say the vaccine candidate can be delivered without needles and will not require to be kept in cold. Israeli archaeologists say they have discovered extremely rare 425 early Islamic gold coins. They said the 24-carat coins were stashed there during the Abbasid Caliphate around 1,100 years ago. Antiquities authorities unearthed the coins at an excavation site in Israel's central city of Yemen. They said the discovery is among the largest caches of ancient coins found in Israel. The trove also includes hundreds of smaller clippings from gold coins that served as denominations around a millennium ago. A Swiss parachutist has become the world's first person who has jumped from a solar-powered electric plane. Parachutist Raphael Domen said the aim of this stunt was to promote renewable energy. Swiss organizer the Solar Stratos project says its 2-seater prototype plane was covered with 22 square meters of solar panels. It said the plane reached the height of 5,000 feet in its test flight over western Switzerland. Head of the project, Domen, says the jump had challenges, but the experience was amazing.
It was not possible for me to stay too long with my feet on the wings because we didn't know how the plane will fly. So I have to go out and to jump quite quickly without pushing, just so I just leave my body going down out of the plane. That was amazing.
Hollywood heartthrob and the first actor to play James Bond on film, Sir Sean Connery, is celebrating his 90th birthday. Connery shot to fame for his charm as Britain's smoothest spy, but his later roles won him acclaim for his acting. This report has the details.
Tall, illustrious, with a throaty voice to match his sometimes grumpy personality, set the bar for being James Bond up in the clouds. Sean Connery played a series of roles other than Bond and won an Oscar for his portrayal of a tough Chicago cop in The Untouchables in 1988. But for millions, he will always be immortalized as the gold standard for British Agent 007, a character written by Ian Fleming and portrayed on screen in Dr. No in 1962.
Look, for me, Sean Connery defined the role, so he's always going to be someone I look towards especially when I started this. And Dr. No and From Russia with Love are two of my favorite films.
Born on August 25, 1930, Connery was brought up in near poverty in the slums of Edinburgh and never attempted to disguise his raw Scottish accent. He got his big break in the 1960s with his performance on a television drama called Requiem for a Heavyweight. Connery had a prolific career outside Bond, starring in movies such as The Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, The Hunt for Red October, and at the age of 70, the critically acclaimed Finding Forrester. Sharing the screen with the legend has been an honor for many.
He's my father, my mentor, my inspiration. Great man, wonderful occasion. I'm delighted to be here to honor him.
Connery married actress Diane Cilento in 1962, but divorced later 11 years later. He later married French divorcee Micheline Roquebrune, whom he met playing golf in 1975. The Scottish actor was knighted by Queen Elizabeth in 2000, 2 years after he was reportedly denied the honor.
American Airlines says it will cut 19,000 jobs in October when a government wage support scheme comes to an end. The airliner said its workforce will shrink by 30% as the job cuts reach 40,000. In a letter to employees, CEO Doug Parker and President Robert Isom said today the airliner shares the hardest message of involuntary staffing reductions. The airline said it received $25 billion as the U.S. government stimulus funds in March meant to cover payrolls and protect jobs through September. But it says the money is fast running out and the airliner needs an additional $25 billion in funds to keep the jobs. The airliner says it now plans to fly less than 50% of its normal schedule in the fourth quarter. The value of US dollar has fallen to a 6-year low against most currencies, plummeting 0.4% in Asia. The dip was triggered by data showing US consumer confidence tumbling due to spike in unemployment. Traders are now bracing for US economic data to be released today, which is expected to show a slump. Investors are now looking forward to Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell's speech at the annual retreat to determine what steps the Fed is willing to take. So far, the data released during this week has been discouraging for the US economy. Meanwhile, the pound sterling has risen by 0.7%. European stocks are trading higher as investors look ahead to the US Federal Reserve's annual report on monetary policy. The Pan-European Stock 600 index is trading almost 0.5% higher. Frankfurt's DAX trades almost 0.5% higher. London's FTSE 100 is down fractionally. CAC 40 in Paris is up by less than 0.25%. And now the weather situation from around the globe. And that is all for now. For the latest updates, you can follow us on social media at Indus News.